online for authors. I'm chatting with Richard Kammen, author of Tortured Justice, Alabama. Welcome, Richard.
Nice to be here. Thank you for having me, Terry.
It is wonderful. I loved the book. It was one of those that made you think. And I love a book that makes me stop and examine my thoughts about life. But before we dive in and really get into the ins and outs of the book, can you give my listeners a quick elevator pitch as to what they're going to find when they read Tortured Justice, Alabama?
Well, Tortured Justice, Alabama is a book that focuses on current events, and especially it focuses on the very real problem of physicians being prosecuted for performing abortions that are legal where they're performed, but the physician or people associated with the abortion are prosecuted in states where the abortion is illegal. And it's really drawn from a case in Indiana that involved an OBGYN by the name of Caitlin Bernard, who wasn't prosecuted but had medical licensing issues for performing an abortion for a girl from Ohio, a 10-year-old rape victim, who came to Indiana for an abortion. And then the Indiana Attorney General went after her license. And so it was drawn from that.
Right. The idea of, we have state laws and then we have national laws. Where do they stop? Where do they start? Do you have the ability to go across state lines and get care that you want from a state that allows it? All of those things come into play here. My question is, first of all, why political thriller? Because that's obviously where your lane is. And this story, what made you pick this story versus all of the other stories I'm sure that you've come in contact with?
Well, a little bit of background. My pre-writing career was as a criminal defense lawyer. Okay. And I think my writing model, I suppose to a certain extent for every lawyer in the United States, it's John Grisham. But I think more particularly for me, there's an English writer by the name of John Mortimer, whose character was Horace Rumpole. It was a popular series in the 80s, Rumpole of the Bailey. It's on PBS, and his books are really quite charming. And Mortimer, as I really looked at it, took current political controversies and made them into fictional cases. And my first book, which Tortured Justice, Guantanamo Bay, really was derived from work I did, because I did represent someone in Guantanamo for several years. And then my second book, Tortured Justice, South Carolina, is prescient, more prescient than I would have wanted, actually, because it deals with the problems women caught up in the immigration system or the criminal justice system can have, and the kinds of abuses they can suffer. But the law, and especially the criminal law, on some level is inherently fodder for political or legal thrillers, because that's the way the world is. You can certainly have murder cases that are not political in the sense of something dealing with abortion. You can certainly have other white-collar cases that may not be political. But at its core, politics invades much of criminal law.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that I noticed, and you did a really good job of, is showing that it's not as cut and dried as people like to think. A law is created. Everyone says, "Oh, goody for the law." It's creating. It's regulating some social issue somehow, and we're all for it. And then comes a case, and then people say, "Well, wait a minute. She was a young girl and she was raped, and in one state it's allowed and in another it's not. And so Like, does this mean that a doctor in a state where it's allowed has to worry now that a state that doesn't allow it is going to sue her? All of these things come out that make you stop and say, wow, it's not really as cut and dried as we like to think when we create these rules.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. And one of the things we're seeing in life is that, these situations are manifesting themselves in a lot of different contexts. For example, and I know this is controversial, so I don't want to get bogged down too much in it, but physicians who are doing telemedicine and prescribing mifepristone, which is essentially an abortion-inducing drugs, there's some physicians who are being prosecuted in states where the drugs are sent. It's legal to send the drugs through the mail. The physician's acting properly, but the states are using laws that are on the books,
right,
that were not created to prosecute doctors, but can be used to prosecute doctors the same way they're used to prosecute drug dealers or
right,
people who cross state lines to commit crimes.
Right. Like I said, I found that aspect to be one of the most fascinating, because as someone who doesn't understand criminal law, it's not where I sit, so I don't know those things. To me, there's just, there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer. And this book opened up 1,000 gray areas for me, where it's like, okay, like what is the answer here? Because even things like the doctor believed that it was medically necessary. She said, yes, this was a medically necessary. This girl was young. I can't remember how old she was. 11, 10, 11?
12.
12. Okay. 12 in the book. So young. She was raped. Not only was she raped, but it was incest. So it was rape by a first cousin. And she said, and this child is small, and this isn't going to be a good thing. It's medically necessary. And then in comes other people saying, prove it's medically necessary. And it's like, oh my gosh. So now doctors can't just practice medicine. They can't say, I believe this is medically necessary, and therefore I'm going to do X, Y, Z, whether it's about abortion or any other of the many possible options out there. And instead they have to have all of this proof that could be held up in a court of law, which changes how doctors do medicine.
I don't think there's any question that we're seeing that. I mean, you hear these horror stories in places like Texas or Louisiana of women who are in some distress, essentially being sent away because they're not in enough distress.
Right.
And the doctors don't want to do anything that might be deemed to be premature, because there are these laws are on some level quite vague. So, physicians I know, I certainly consulted with some as I was writing, and have come to know some as a result of this particular book, have said that for OBGYNs, it has changed the way they do medicine. And of course, I think the other thing that has happened is that a lot of physicians are choosing not to practice in some states.
Yes.
And I think it's having that impact as well.
Yeah. And a lot of physicians are not only deciding not to practice in some states, but are deciding just not to practice.
Sure.
That it's just not worth it to them. They do not want that hanging over them. They've been in the field for 15 years, and they say, we're just done now. I'm going to stop this, which ultimately is going to hurt people, because then when you go and you need a physician, there isn't one to be had because everyone is afraid to do their job. Right. And I think that happens not just in this case of abortion, but in things like, I know for a long time, providing any kind of pain relief medication became a huge issue, right? And so if you had someone who actually needed pain relief medication, you felt like you couldn't or shouldn't, and you had to like my husband had horrible problems and needed some pain medicine, but he was only given certain number of pills every 45 days kind of thing. And the doctors had to be so careful. So I think that this book, though this is about the abortion issue across these two states, it sheds the light just on medical and how laws, things that are supposed to be political, jump in and really change how doctors navigate their patient-doctor relationship.
I think that's true. I mean, that certainly wasn't the intent of the book, but it's
but it shows up. I mean, I
right.
think it really shows up there, right? You brought up the fact that you consulted doctors. So let's talk a little bit about any research that you had to do in order to make this book real.
Well, the main one was twofold. I mean, basically, it's the mechanics of an abortion. What does that look like? There's several different ways. There's D&C, there's suction, there's different ways of performing an appropriate abortion. The other thing that I was aware of, but probably not very conscious of, is the fact that what is an abortion, a dilation and curettage, is a very necessary part of women's health care.
Yeah.
And so it's people who might be having a miscarriage, and where it's clear that there's going to be a miscarriage, which carries some element of danger for the mother. The appropriate care in many cases is to go ahead and do the D&C, which effectively is an abortion. And so just getting a sense from the doctor's perspective of how this worked, what this would look like, what it would look like for if in the book, for example, the physician is consulting with the girl's mother, but many states, in fact, most states now, even states where abortion is legal, have laws where the physician is required to go through a script.
Yeah.
So the question came up, okay, the physician goes through the script with the mother, fair enough, but is she required to go through the script with the little girl, who at best is going to, a 12-year-old is, who knows how much she's really going to understand. So, doctors, we talked about that. And it was interesting because one of the doctors I spoke with, who was an OBGYN, and I ran this by her, and she said, I never thought about that.
Yeah.
I really don't know. And that's kind of what led to the part in the book where the doctor's consulting with the mother and then says, well, to be on the safe side, let me read the script to your girl, to your daughter.
To your daughter as well. Right.
Just to dot all the I's and cross all the T's.
Right. And I think that does make once again, you brought in a lot of questions in something that looks cut and dried on paper. And in the little news clips that you get, right? You only see the little piece that they want you to see, and you don't see all this other stuff that comes into play.
And the other part, although this part of my practice, while it was largely in criminal defense, for several years, and I represented physicians who were required for one reason or another to appear before the medical licensing board. And what I didn't know until I began doing that work, but I know from Dr. Bernard's case and just from life, is having being charged with a crime. If a physician is charged with a crime, that will bring up almost invariably a requirement that they appear before their state medical licensing board, which has a host of residual consequences. For example, their insurance can be canceled. Their hospital privileges can be canceled. And so all of these ancillary effects of a decision by a prosecutor can have enormous impact on a physician's practice and on their lives. And while I certainly was not part of her case, I was familiar with Dr. Bernard's case, and she was brought before the Indiana Medical Licensing Board. There was a rather extensive hearing. In the end, I think they fined her $3,000, but it was in a way that it didn't impact her insurance or her
Right.
hospital privileges or anything like that. But that was probably more, in my view, of a political decision to do something, but nothing.
But not. Right.
But
Right.
not
Right.
any consequence. But
Right.
that, I'm sure, was an enormously stressful time for her. It would be for any doctor.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. So that's some things that, like you said, you knew some, but you didn't know a lot.
Sure.
And
yeah,
so
it's like every author. You do the work. You do the
research, right? What do you think of research? Do you enjoy that portion of the project?
Sure. I mean, you write what you know, and so much of my books are, they certainly focus on criminal proceedings, criminal trials. They'll focus on conversations that either I've had or in different contexts or that I know other lawyers have had. But in the end, there's always research that needs to be done, just because, for example, I live in South Carolina now, but I've never practiced law here. So when I decided to set one of my books in Beaufort, that's 30 miles away. Well, you need to go to the courthouse. What does it look like?
Right. No, I agree. And I love the research process. It's one of the things that, to me, I found like the perfect job for myself, which is I love to research and I love to write, and like, wow, an author, isn't that perfect? Like I get to do both of those things. So that's interesting. I'm curious about the fact, like, you do not shy away from headline issues. You just kind of jump in there and say, this is a headline issue. I'm going to write about it. Has that ever been a problem for you as an author, or just as, Richard Kammen, who's, living in South Carolina? Has that ever blown back on you in any way?
No.
Awesome.
Wait, I mean, interestingly, the Tortured Justice Alabama, which, as you said, focuses on abortion. Some of my readers, I think, have found it tougher. That is a more polarizing issue than most. Guantanamo's kind of off people's radar. It's sort of like another world. The immigration book was written before the current crackdown. I think it's perhaps more timely now, but it's nobody has said, "Damn, you shouldn't have written this book." But a few people have said, "This was hard for me," and I understand that. I mean, people who I understand that people of good faith can feel that abortion is wrong. I mean, it's a more nuanced issue than some people want to believe. Right. And so I think in that sense, it's harder. It's harder reading for some people, and I think for people who support the right to abortion, they can see, oh my, even if I live in a state where abortion is legal, it's no sure thing. And if you live in a state like so many, where abortion is effectively banned, it then becomes much more complicated. And I know women, who grew up as baby boomers, as I did, where pretty much choice was a given. Birth control was a given. freedom, bodily autonomy was a given. I think some of women have looked and said, I really didn't, the future is darker than I wanted to believe.
Right.
And
right.
so in that sense, it's been not an issue, but a reaction for sure.
A reaction. Right. Right. I think that regardless of which side someone falls on the issue, that the book opens your eyes to the fact that there's more than what you think there is.
Sure.
Which is the part that I just keep going back to is, regardless of where you stand, regardless of what your personal beliefs are, there are a lot of things at issue that come up in this book that we see. What about states' rights? If a state does it matter then if you're in that state, who your patient is? And you brought up, not in the book, but can you send drugs across state lines? What constitutes patient-doctor privilege? When is a doctor allowed to make a determination that something is medically necessary? All of those things come into play. And for those who believe that abortion should not be legal, most people who believe that do believe in the idea that if a mother's health is at stake, or she has been raped, or there's been incest, that it should be allowed. And they believe that's what's happening. And yet, in practice, it may not be what's happening.
Well, and in fact, many laws in many states, it makes no difference if the mother's life is in danger, or the mother's life has to be in so much danger that it is, almost grotesque. And I think more importantly, in states like certainly Texas and South Carolina and many states, if you're the victim of rape, even incest, it's tough luck. They want you to have the baby.
Right.
And there's this notion, that it'll all work out. And I suppose there are cases where it does, but this is completely off the topic.
Yeah.
But I mean, maybe it's not. I represented in a completely different context a young man who was charged with murder. Because of the nature of the case, we really had to explore his life. And what we had learned was that he was the product of rape. His mother had been raped and she had the baby. But her response when our client was born in the hospital was to try and give him away. And so that didn't happen, but he grew up in a home without love,
right,
and probably with a certain amount of residual hostility that impacted his entire life. And,
right.
And so, these decisions have consequences that we won't even
right.
Can't even
that
see.
we won't see for years to come. Right. Absolutely. Jumping back to the book, I'm curious, do you have a favorite character in Tortured Justice, Alabama?
Yeah, I do. It's probably the lawyer's daughter.
Okay. Tell us why. Explain why you like her.
Well, she surfaces in, a little bit of background. All three books are kind of a series. A lot of the characters overlap. And so in the first book, the lawyer's daughter is in college. She's only sort of floating on the sidelines of the second book. But in the third book, she is in law school. And, as a young woman, the abortion issue is very important to her. And so even though she's in law school in Boston and the lawyer's in Indiana and the case is in Alabama, she basically says, Dad, I'm taking a semester off to work on the case. And, the lawyer says, look, this may break bad.
Right.
This is not no sure thing. And watching her come to terms with that, and not really accepting that. I mean, even in the end, and I think what she and other women in characters in the book, there's a lawyer, a woman lawyer, Capitaliano, and they are constantly saying to the protagonist lawyer, whose name is Connor Mendelsohn, it's not a case. It's not just about this doctor. It's bigger than her. And you have to accept that. And he doesn't for quite a time. But finally, his daughter, largely, and the other lawyer basically sit him down and say, look, you've got to, when you're going to do this argument, you can't make it just about the doctor. You've got to make it about the jurors' wives and daughters and granddaughters. That's what's got to happen.
Right.
And so, seeing her growth, then in the end, she goes back to law school, and she has this, one of the interesting things about practice in criminal law, criminal law is not for everybody. It's not for every lawyer. And a lot of people think, oh my God, how can you represent people who've done these things?
Right,
and I get that.
Right.
But it is a fact of our lives in this profession that when we go to, if there's a group of lawyers at a cocktail party or dinner party or something, nobody wants to hear about the last contract some lawyer wrote or, the last will, but they sure want to hear tell me about this murder case you're working on.
Right.
And so the daughter then, she goes back to law school, and her professors want to know, well, what was it like? Tell me the gossip. Tell me that. And, she basically says, I want to have good war stories. This is what I want to do. Right. So watching her grow, I think that was, for me, as a character, that was very cool.
I'm sure it was. So quickly, what are you working on next, Richard? I'm assuming we're not done, that you're going to keep writing.
I'm working on a book that is set in Detroit because I did some work in Detroit many years ago, and it's a city I really love. And it involves the fact that many police officers suffer from PTSD. And so I think that some of the violence that we see from police officers that seems mindless and shocking, and is a result of PTSD because most police officers now have been in the military. And so the central story is a black police officer shoots a young white kid who's involved in drug trafficking. And it's a senseless and sort of almost, you can't understand it, killing. And, is it about race? Is it about wealth? Or is it about PTSD? And so that's the central story. And obviously there's other pieces to it as well. But
so is it gonna also be called Tortured Justice and be Tortured Justice Detroit, or is this a new
I'm
series?
Not sure.
You're not sure yet. Okay. I love that answer. That's the way I feel when people ask me sometimes. It's like, yeah, we'll see. We'll just see where it goes. Absolutely. So Richard, if someone wanted to get in touch with you, talk with you about Tortured Justice Alabama, your other books, the things coming up, what's the best way to do that?
Well, my email is richard@kammenlaw.com, or My websites are richardkammen.com and torturedjustice.com. I'm also on Facebook and all the other
Fantastic.
stuff.
Guys, I'll have all that in the show notes, so you'll be able to reach right out to Richard should you want to chat with him or buy one of his books, which you definitely want to do. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Like I said, I found it to be a thinking book. It's definitely one that will get you really questioning where you stand on things and why, and what can be done about it if you see any problems. And I saw a lot of problems. And once you've read the book, make sure you run out and do a great a review, because we really need those reviews.
Reviews, I did not appreciate how important reviews are.
They are so important. And so, if in fact, not just Richard's book, but any book, if you read a book and enjoy it, make sure that you do a review for that book. And Richard, I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
Terry, thank you. It was a pleasure, and it's good seeing you again.
Thank you for listening to Online for Authors, where I, Terry M. Brown, author of character-driven fiction and host of the podcast, introduce readers to characters they'd love to invite to lunch. Tune in next Tuesday for another podcast episode.